Thank you all for coming to the first event in the Asian Deaf Lecture Series this semester to hear our guest speaker, Xine Yao from University College London. My name is Michelle Wong and I'm Associate Professor in the Department of Art History at Georgetown. And I'd like to just begin by thanking our sponsors. Our major sponsor is the Asian Studies Program in the School of Foreign Service. Many thanks to Kelly Liu, who has facilitated funding support for this year's events. Our thanks also to Chris Sealing in the Department of History for handling the behind-the-scenes administrative details. And I'd like to also thank our other co-sponsors for today's lecture, and they are the American Studies Program, the Department of African American Studies, the Department of English, and the Georgetown Humanities Initiative. I'd also like to mention that we are recording today's lecture, and so if you feel shy about being on camera, you might want to turn off your video feed at this point. And now it's my pleasure to turn things over to my colleague, Shelby Nowlett-Meisner, and she's an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy at Georgetown. Well, she specializes in American Indian and Indigenous philosophy, feminist epistemology, and philosophy of language. Her primary research concerns Indigenous language vitalization and questions about the relationships between Indigenous languages, knowledge systems, and power. Okay, thanks so much, Shelby.
Thank you, Michelle. Miyuyam notong Shelby Nowlett-Meisner yaka no natach pikwim kawish. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Michelle, for that introduction. I've been invited today to offer a land acknowledgement and introduce Xine. And to begin with a land acknowledgement, we're going to do it a little bit unorthodoxly in the sense that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the academic practice of a land acknowledgement, in that oftentimes before academic engagements, folks will come up and talk about whose land a university colonially occupies. That's a practice that has been called into question in a lot of ways because of the tendency for it to become metaphorical or lip service, and also called into question in spaces like Zoom, where suddenly we're all coming from very, very different contexts. So you may also know, again, that land acknowledgements are being critiqued by Indigenous communities and other communities for lots of different and compelling reasons. And you may also know, those of you who are in the Georgetown context, that Georgetown University does not have an official land acknowledgement. So kind of holding all of that in tension, instead of approaching the need for a land acknowledgement by convening select faculty and drafting a brief statement that recognizes the Indigenous communities whose land is occupied by Georgetown, we are proposing the creation and continued maintenance of a land acknowledgement process. We acknowledge that this meeting is taking place on the ancestral territory of the Piscataway and Anacostan people, but this acknowledgement is incomplete without being coupled with material, educational, relational, and spiritual reparations. In lieu of a stagnant and virtue signaling statement, we invite you to learn more about Georgetown's ongoing land acknowledgement process and look forward to your active engagement with our relationship building process. And this is designed as a replicable land acknowledgement process that those of you who are in different contexts are please reach out and we're happy to share. That being said, I'm honored to introduce Xine Yao. Xine Yao is lecturer in American literature to 1900 at University College London. Their first book is Disaffected: The Cultural Politics of Unfeeling in 19th Century America, which is gorgeous. I have mine too. I was just telling Xine, I showed it all around to everyone. It's so gorgeous. I highly recommend being able to physically hold it in your hand. It has won the Duke University Press's Scholar of Color First Book Award. Her honors also include the American Studies Association Yasuo Sakakibara Essay Prize, and their research has been supported by grants from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. She is a BBC Radio 3AHRC New Generation thinker and the co-host of PH Divas podcast, which is also very, very cool. So without further ado, I am so honored to introduce and welcome Xine Yao.
Thank you so much, Shelby, for that wonderful introduction. So I do have a PowerPoint, and I know that there's all the cliche things we say if we're setting up PowerPoints as well. I'm just having my multiple screens going to go. So thank you again so much, Shelby, for the introduction. And I really appreciated hearing what Georgetown is doing in terms of thinking about what can a land acknowledgement do meaningfully. And this is something I also want to address just in a bit. But first, I also want to thank you so much to Michelle Wang and to Jim Millward. And also for everyone who's responsible behind the scenes for the Asia in Depth series. Like, I know that running speaker series like this takes a lot of work, lots of emails in a time of ever increasing emails. And I really appreciate the way that this has been such a coalitional effort of so many different departments and programs. And in a way, I feel like that's only appropriate to what I'll be talking about today in terms about thinking about BIPOC coalitions or other sort of insurgent communities and counter intimacies of being together otherwise. So before I start my talk, I want to talk a little bit about land acknowledgements. That my project was done as I was living on variously the land, the former land of the Cayuga Nation, the unceded ancestral territory of the Musqueam people, and I originally am from Toronto, which is on Haudenosaunee territory. And yet, when I came to the UK, obviously the sort of mantra that we have from Takinyan to give back the land operates very differently in the former heart of empire. Here, the term indigenous is one that is co-opted by racist Brexiteers against immigration and by trans exclusionary radical feminists. Here I quip about how I came from the colonies to teach the English literature. And I'm working at UCL, which should be known, if you don't already know, as a place that was built on the legacy and ongoing history of eugenics. And currently we are part of one of the pressure points that has yielded to trans-exclusionary radical feminism in the UK, which is spreading across so many different institutions. And so I want to give a little bit of that background, as well as the fact that there are only about 30 Black women who are full professors across the UK in any discipline. And I hope that sort of gives you a sense of like the different convergences of the particular textures in my little corner of empire, which I think are important for addressing the way that I'm trying to talk about this particular facet of my book, which is actually the final chapter. So let me just maybe shift here to number my epigraphs. But why am I talking about Oriental Inscrutability? And I really thank the Asian Depth series for giving me an opportunity to discuss that. It's actually the final chapter of my whole book. And in a way, but it was also the first place where I started theorizing. And I think that sort of captures the paradox between how I, through the book, I'm trying to assemble thinking about this sort of racialized, gendered, queer forms of unfeeling as dissent and dissatisfaction through the early 19th century in American literature through to the turn of the 20th century, when we have authors of Asian diasporic descent like Xine Yao. But I think that what's important, that before I come to that point, I have to address and think about the different formations of Blackness, anti-Blackness, settler colonialism, and particularly Black and Indigenous coalition before I get to that final chapter. And so while the 5th chapter on Oriental Inscrutability was how I first started thinking about it, nonetheless, I feel like it's only appropriate that it comes at the end, much like my own positionality. And indeed, the story structure of my book is around the sort of plot twist that at the end, you know, in the way that you're supposed to disavow for academic books, it was about me all along. And so in a way, like the title of this talk about thinking about Oriental Inscrutability as a queer racialized mode amidst, in the context of anti-Blackness and settler colonialism, is also very much about my own positionality. And I also want to just highlight a little bit that, of course, I think it's interesting that the distinctiveness of Oriental Inscrutability allows us to track how other racialized forms of unfeeling associated with immigrants manifest in the wake of the evolving American cultural sentiment predicated on structural violences against Black Indigenous peoples. And that the way it's very nameable and has a contingent fetishization indicates the respective respects allotted to the capacity racialized as Asian, as opposed to Black or Indigenous affects, which are readily deemed as illegitimate, regardless in terms of the fullness of expression or inexpression at the same time. And so Sorry for that prelude. In my talk today, I'll be giving a little bit of the overall framework, and then I'll be talking a little bit about the work on Suisse and Far and Oriental Inscrutability. Finally, at the end, I understand that this series has been trying as much as possible to sort of foster a casual hangout setting after the recording ends. If it's any incentive, I'm happy to use that time to talk very familiarly about the struggles that I had writing this book, which I personally wish I could have heard from scholars when I myself was at the pre-book stage. So with that, you have my lovely epigraphs that I will be talking you through. White feelings, white tears, white fragility, white women's tears, white men's tears. These phrases circulate within popular anti-racist social justice discourse galvanized by Black Lives Matter. These phrases articulate frustration with the ongoing manifestations of what scholars have variously called the unfinished business of sentimentality, the legacies of the intimacies of four continents, and the biopolitics of feeling. They name the weaponization of white feelings in everyday life. Behind these uses is the implicit statement: we have always known that white feelings produce and maintain structures of domination. To depend upon white feelings as a catalyst of social change reinscribes the very world that enables their power. So, no more business with white sentimentality. Withhold from them those colonial intimacies. Refuse to feel according to the hierarchies of the biopolitics of feeling. Be disaffected. There is ambivalence. There is discontent. Philosophers Sylvia Wynter and Denise Ferreira da Silva have argued that the category of man, bourgeois Western whiteness, overrepresents itself as universal humanity structured upon the suppression of racialized modalities of the human as mere derivations. Following lines of inquiry opened up for us by their insights, what operations are concealed and enabled by the construct of universal feeling as symptom and signifier of that coloniality? Affectability, according to De Silva in her study of Enlightenment universality, transmuted into the biopolitical apparatuses of global modernity, is, in her words, as I have there, the condition of being both subjected to both natural and the scientific and licence conditions into others' power. According to De Silva, affectability defines raciality. And she says the transparent I has the agency to know and affect, while the affectable I is the susceptible scientific construction of non-European minds. In this way, De Silva recalls for us Spinoza's foundational proposition about the nature of emotions in relation to the world. Spinoza states, by emotion, I understand the modifications of the body by which the power of the acting of the body itself is increased and diminished, helped or hindered, together with the ideas of these modifications. And although not written with affect studies in mind, De Silva's definition of affectability, as scholar Tyrone S. Palmer observes, points to, quote, the inextricability of affect from power, end quote. Disaffection then threatens a break from affectability. I ask, how does unfeeling operate as a constitutive outside to that totalizing system, and what challenge can disaffection pose? In this regard, I take unfeeling not simply as negative feelings or the absence of feelings, but as that which cannot be recognized as feeling, the negation of feeling itself. By foregrounding the heuristic of unfeeling as disaffection in its effective, causal, and political meanings, I hope that this work makes key interventions in our understanding of affect and politics in American literature and culture, a paradigm which has disproportionately affected the world. First, I reconsider unfeeling as an index to the under-acknowledged spectrum of dissonance and dissent that critiques the demands of sympathetic recognition shaped by sentimentalism, questioning the liberal project of inclusion. Second, I explore unfeeling in both the responsive and demonstrative senses as a quotidian tactic of survival and a counterintuitive, sometimes counteractive mode of care. Finally, I propose that these antisocial affects are vilified as unfeeling because they have insurgent potential that may not be legible or instrumentalized towards resistance. Following Raymond Williams' definition of structures of feeling as effective workings of ideology and lived experience, disaffection may be the unfeeling rupture that enables new structures of feeling to arise. In other words, the reading of unfeeling as oppositional negation functions as a defensive denial of the quickening, flourishing, and renewal of alternative forms of sociality made possible by feeling otherwise. I'm not so much interested in fine-tuning the distinctions between agentic volition and instinctual physiology that attend the generally held taxonomization of the strata of affect, feeling, and emotional expression, ordered along the polarization of axes of interiority to externalization and unconscious to conscious, as in rather stressing how the flexible operations of how these differentiations naturalize the scales of human, non-human, living, and non-living, which Mel Chen groups under the rubric of animacy hierarchy. Of greater concern to me are the operations of unfeeling as a form of antisocial discontent, if not defiance, against the compulsory norms for expressing feeling, along with susceptibility to the feelings of others. It can signal skepticism, reluctance to signify the appropriate expressions of affect that are socially legible as human, or the refusal to care and sympathize as part of the expected cues of deference that maintain a structure of biopolitical hierarchies of oppression. Insofar as Lauren Berlant points out that withholding can operate as a sign of civility for the privileged and, in her words, is often deemed good manners in the servant class that from those so-called problem populations, disaffection signals the threat of the ungovernable. The popular understanding of emotional labor, originally coined by sociologist Arlie Hochschild, is a useful means to address the uneven expectations about who does this labor and for whom, according to the overlapping but irreducible processes of racialization, class differentiation, and their modulations of sexual difference that adhere despite the promise of socioeconomic mobility. We can recall that W.E. Du Bois begins The Souls of Black Folk with the question, how does it feel to be a problem? Affect's deracinated universality is part of its appeal as a critical turn, surmises Claire Hemmings, a productive way out of the impasse of deconstruction and hegemony by attending to embodied experience, aleatory attachments, and the quirky textures of everyday life as potentially transformative. And despite Sarah Ahmed's oeuvre on how affective economies shape significations and relations of individual and collective bodies, and of course CNI's work on racialized animatedness, and to some extent her discussion of irritation, they too often remain exceptions, regardless of their influence. Work by David Eng and Jasbir Puar has enabled us to better understand how affect operates on geopolitical and transnational scales through diaspora, kinship, debility, and capacity. And yet in turn, their insights highlight the insidious convenience of the epistemic erasures and colonial portability of more abstracted universalist frameworks of feeling. In this vein, post-colonial feminist queer writers of color like Audre Lorde, Valeria Anzaldúa, Sherry Moraga, and others have been ignored as theorists of affect despite the centrality of feeling to their work. And this is something I'm happy to expand upon in Q&A. On the level of scholarship, then, we must confront that the systemic refusal to take these conceptualizations of feeling as valid mirrors the historical and cultural denials of the feelings of peoples of color and those other disaffected minoritized population. In this sense, they are subordinated as unfeeling within the academic episteme too. And demands for change have been issued. There are calls for decolonizing or racializing affect studies by recognizing how it works for Black, Indigenous, and other peoples of color, and also the need to adopt non-Western taxonomies and paradigms of affect. Through what I view as an ongoing antisocial turn in affect theory, I suggest unfeeling constitutes a break from dominant models of feeling. Affect aliens like the feminist killjoy and the angry Black woman, according to Ahmed, disrupt normative conventions of happiness. Then what are the implications of alienation from affect itself? For critics like Lauren Berlant and Wendy Lee, the phenomenon of unfeeling entails both frustration and promise. And here to my passage from Morton F. M. Manalassen. By disaffection, I emphasize not only emotional distance, alienation, antipathy, and isolation, but also to center this word's other connotation as this disloyalty to regimes of power and authority. And here he theorizes in relation to Filipinx domestic workers navigating the global care economy. And for him, this model of disaffection acts as a counterpoint to third world demands for feeling and labor. Instead, a type of quotidian performance that enables the execution of labor, but also the potential for activism. The appearance of being unmoved concealing its potential for the choice to be moved and move in other ways. So put another way, marginalized unfeeling is unrecognized underside to the universalized feelings of the dominant. And so what are some ways I'm using unfeeling? I use it as a broad term for a range of affective modes, performances, moments, patterns, and practices that fall outside or are not legible to dominant regimes of expression, including but not limited to withholding, disregard, growing a thick skin, refusal to care, opacity, numbness, dissociation, inscrutability, frigidity, insensibility, obduracy, flatness, insensitivity, disaffection, coldness, heartlessness, fatigue, desensitization, and emotional unavailability. And at this point, during COVID, I would add burnout. In short, those who are disaffected break from affectability, presenting as unaffected. These inexpressive expressions suddenly thwart the supposed universality of affects encompassing intimacies, tracking the edges of their influences and suggesting a beyond to their limits. I suspect there's a congruence then between these processes of disaffection and Jose Esteban Munoz's disidentifications. That is, a suspension of relationality allows for creative remakings in the struggle toward the horizon of queerness with its potentialities and possibilities. Unfeeling is a radical detachment from attachments to hegemonic structures of feeling towards a radical politics of liberation. So now I just want to just briefly show you some of the chapters that I'm skipping over in order to get to my one on Suisse and Far, where I established these frameworks for thinking about different transnational forms of anti-Blackness and white intimacies, and also thinking about Black and Indigenous counter-intimacies in particular, and critiquing, of course, the way that so many scholars in Black and Indigenous studies now are pointing out the way that those terms are complicated, but also should be seen as non-exclusionary. And then I say turn to white womanhood and the particular form of white queer frigidity of professionalism, and thinking about anesthesia and the sort of critique of the marriage plot. I then follow that with looking at the work of 19th century Black women doctors, and then rethinking Frances Ellen Watkin Harper's Iola Leroy for the potential of her as a Black woman doctor, navigating that form of Black objective passionlessness that feminist theorists like Anne Desailles have called passionlessness, alongside dispassionate objectivity from the medical sphere. And these are sort of ways in which I'm trying to continue to fracture and fragment and provincialize the concept of sympathy. And so a little bit on the background of what I'm trying to do across all these different chapters. And so again, sympathy as this universal concept forming the basis of the apparatus sentimentalism. And this is something I really want to highlight, that the universality of sympathy emerges from the colonial imposition of the Enlightenment episteme. And again, this universality is a function of the overrepresented status of whiteness, both producer and product and producer of intimate transnational violences of imperialism that made possible Western modernity. And the principle of sympathy has been held by Americanist scholars a key to the development of the United States as nation state, identification across different shapes of belonging, ideas of citizenship, and the construction of the body politic. Of course, simultaneously, as Saidiya Hartman points out, it's one of the fundamental ethical problems, questions, crises for the West. As she says, it's as though to come to any recognition of common humanity, the other must be assimilated, meaning in this case, utterly displaced and effaced. And reading a lot of Americanist criticism from about the 18th and 19th century, perhaps you're no doubt already familiar with the paradigmatic definition by Adam Smith that opens the theory of moral sentiments. This is the part that everyone quotes. Whatever is the passion that arises from any object in the person principally concerned, an analogous emotion springs up at the thought of his situation in the breast of every attentive spectator, end quote. In this regard, I want to emphasize the foundational nature of sympathy as more than a historical antecedent to theorizations of affect. Rather, sympathy is the fundamental mode of apprehending affects, feelings, and emotions, and deeming them legitimate. And it's much later on in this incredibly oversized tome, which sort of makes you realize why people just usually quote from the first couple of pages when it's like 700-800 pages long. But it's later on that he abandons that guise of universal abstraction to reveal the schematics of sympathy that reproduce the material relations of colonialism. Shifting to the global stage, he divides humanity along the line of sympathy. While the civilized nations are said to be founded on humanity, there are those rude and barbarous nations focused on what he calls self-denial. For him, the figure of the savage is the ultimate figure of unfeeling. Smith complains he expects no feeling sympathy from those around him and disdains on that account to expose himself by allowing the least weakness to escape him. In this framework, he poses the savage as inexpressive, unreactive, refusing to change the serenity of his countenance or the composure of his conduct and behavior. And he says, unlike the civilized nations, these barbaric peoples of color are prone to what he calls falsehood and dissimulation. And, quote, he says, it is observant among all those who be conversant with savage nations, whether in Asia, Africa, or America, that they are equally impenetrable, and that, when they have a mind to conceal the truth, no examination is capable of drawing it from them, end quote. I find this a really fascinating passage. These Asian, Black, and Indigenous peoples deny affectability, caring not about whether they are sympathetic to Western scrutiny. And Smith, in turn, is unsympathetic, unable to recognize those racialized feelings. He complains they never express themselves by any outward emotion, conveniently eliding the colonial dynamics of the epistemological imperative. And so following what De Silva would call affectability, he's unable to comprehend the possibility of the emotional complexity of Black and Indigenous and other peoples of color, or the validity of their affective interiorities as fully human subjects. To only acknowledge sympathy as feeling across difference erases violent origins in the matrices of domination that produce the system of racial differentiation, limiting our understanding of the hierarchies built into the concept, which has been foundational to the geopolitical configurations of modernity, including the construction of the United States. Rather, to attend to these erasures of this form of unfeeling, we must read the archive in oppositional ways. In Smith's, for instance, rereading that passage I gave you, we could discern the anti-colonial disaffection of those equally unpenetrable peoples of Asia, Africa, and America, indeed an early prefiguration of what people might call the global majority, or perhaps later in the 20th century, third world solidarities. Insofar as scholar Lisa Lowe names unequal violences of Black enslavement, Indigenous genocidal dispossession, and Asian indentured servitude, these are the intimacies that constitute global modernity. I suggest that these counter-intimacies also emerge as this opposition. And so to selection from this final chapter from my book. I have come from a race on my mother's side, which is said to be the most stolid and insensible to feeling of all races. Yet I look back over the years and see myself so keenly alive to every shade of sorrow and suffering that is almost a pain to live. And this comes from Edith Maud Eaton writing under her Chinese pen name, Sui Sun Far, in her memoir, Leaves from the Mental Portfolio of Eurasia. Oriental inscrutability is perhaps the most coherent racialized mode of unfeeling, its nameability indicative of a structurally pervasive, but still addressable phenomenon in the Western cultural imagination. However, in the reviews of her only published collection of work and her only book, the New York Times dissented. This unknown reviewer writes, Miss Eaton has struck a new note in American fiction. She has not struck it very well or with surpassing skill. The Times critic scrutinized the collection vis-a-vis sentimentality, commenting, the thing she has tried to do is to portray for the readers of the white race the lives, feelings, and sentiments of the Americanized Chinese of the Pacific coast, of those who have intermarried with them, and of the children who have sprung from such unions. Transparency is lauded. Sorry. The review commends the glimpses she gives into the lives, thoughts, and emotions of the Chinese women who refuse to be anything but intensely Chinese. Intense coughing right now. Give me a moment. Sorry. Obfuscation, however, is not, and this is what it deems harshly. In some of the stories, she seems not to have even tried to see inside the souls of her people, but has contented herself with the mere sketching of externals. Thus, the writer considered the origin of point for Asian North American literature disappoints those readers of the white race seeking access to the souls of her people. The Exclusion Era shaped expectations for Chinese literary representation that bear resemblance to the invasive scrutiny of those evolving apparatuses of US immigration. Insofar as the Chinese were defined as aliens ineligible for citizenship, implicitly at stake in the domain of literature is their eligibility for sympathy in the hearts of the American citizenry. Nevertheless, according to the New York Times, Sui Sun Far's Chinese characters sometimes remain inscrutable Orientals who are, in multiple senses, hard to read. Some passages from the speech from Senator Miller that if successfully introduced the bill that would become the Chinese Exclusion Act, he claims that in sharp contrast to the hapless, wholesome white American worker whose job is endangered by these yellow hordes, these strange people, quote, have become machine-like in every physical characteristic, automatic engines of flesh and blood. And he complains, they are patient, stolid, unemotional, and persistent, end quote. And so the suggestion then is that inscrutability might not just constitute an impassive mask indecipherable to Western eyes, but actually a signifier of Oriental ontological hollowness. I suggest also there's an overlooked factor to Oriental inscrutability that compounds this trope of racialized unfeeling bound to American geopolitical and economic anxieties, the challenge posed by a Chinese face. And conveniently enough, hopefully I beat my face appropriately enough for this discussion. By face, I refer to the Chinese concept that brings together individual composure and social relations, an alternative taxonomy of effective expression that troubles the colonial ruse of universal true feeling. Sui Sun Far's journalism and fiction explores the lived experiences of the fault lines between these emotional regimes for diasporic and mixed-race Chinese. Though she works between these between the clash between Chinese face and white American sympathies, her writings theorize how the phenomenon of Oriental inscrutability should not be vilified, given its function as an everyday means for psychic survival. This Chinese alienness, therefore, is an effect of structural alienation. She traces the different gendered manifestations of the inscrutable face as a form of endurance, withholding and even outright defiance through performative composure that cannot be explained away as mere cultural misunderstanding. For instance, for Chinese men as sojourners, their inscrutable uses of face emerge from the constitutive relationship between their physical and effective labor on behalf of their prioritization of Chinese kinships in Chinatown enclaves and overseas. Chinese women, on the other hand, make recourse to the ornamentalist artifices deemed Oriental as a form of withholding from the gaze that fetishizes their inscrutability as a challenge to be overcome. From Ray Chow, while the Chinese remain inscrutable, I remain lucid. Their object-like obscurity constitutes my subjectivity, my humanity, and she observes this as part of the logic that underlies Jacques Derrida's construction of global theory by characterizing Chinese as a language as inscrutable. She points out that this inscrutability collapses Chinese faces, Chinese cultures, and Chinese language into surface that stigmatizes another culture as once corporeally and linguistically intractable, and perhaps signifies the cross-ethnic stereotype par excellence. The image of the Chinese as inscrutable, Chow argues, renders an entire people as mere face. Distrust of the legibility and humanity of Chinese faces, however, goes beyond the scapegoating of the racialized face as the embodied and symbolic site of emotional expressiveness. Face, as some people may know, in Chinese culture articulates a complex cluster of social behaviors. In brief, there are two main types of face, Mian and Lian, and here I have to say that my accent is terrible, and perhaps you might want to say is a type of practice of the sort of fragmented sense of Chineseness that Sui Sun Far herself occupies. And these two different types of face have rich taxonomies of concrete and figurative meanings that are contextualized by social dynamics. But for Americans, the encounter with this Chinese meaning of face, this alternative cultural taxonomy, disrupts a presumed universalist paradigm of affective and social expression that goes back to Adam Smith's fellow feeling. With this other sense of face in play, the Chinese could be seen, as it were, dangerously two-faced. The most read American text on the Chinese throughout the early 20th century gives us the sense of face as a comprehensive metaphor for Oriental inscrutability and its attendant evils. Missionary Arthur H. Smith's Chinese Characteristics from 1890 expands upon what he calls the usual expressive visage of the Chinese. For Smith, the Chinese concept of face becomes face as defining Chinese concept, a legacy of cultural translation that critic Lydia Liu argues continues to haunt both Chinese and American contexts today. This chapter called face opens the book. At first, nothing could be more irrational than to call what that is shared with the whole human race a characteristic of the Chinese. But the word face does not in China simply signify the front of the head, but is literally a compound noun, a multitude, with more meanings than we're able to describe or perhaps to comprehend. Pivoting from the corporeal to sociocultural codes to inscrutable racial essence, here we can see the reduction of entire people to mere face as articulated by Ray Chow. And so I return to what Sui Sun Far said in her Leibniz portfolio of Eurasian, that the Chinese people may have no souls, no expression on their faces, be altogether beyond the pale of civilization, but whatever they are, I want you to understand that I am a Chinese. And we can see this as a type of racialized coming out in her Chineseness that shatters how she as a mixed race person is read phenotypically as white. This gesture of defiance comes from her recollection of an event involving anti-Chinese comments sparked by the transnational continental railroads running through the racist small Midwestern town. And what sparked it? Her employer actually was musing, somehow or other, I cannot reconcile myself to the thought that the Chinese are humans like ourselves. They may have immortal souls, but their faces seem to be so utterly devoid of expression, I cannot help but doubt, end quote. She is employed by him as his stenographer, a common occupation for single women. We may note that her duty to faithfully translate his words into type dovetails into the trope of Chinese imitativeness. But in her response, Farr reworks his phrases concerning the dubious nature of Chinese souls and expressionless Oriental faces. But in doing so, she does not directly disprove those actual allegations. Instead, she says those tropes may be true, obstinately reaffirming the threatening instability of that epistemic affective indeterminacy. The human ontology of the Chinese may indeed be ineluctable, unknowable, whatever they are in his phrase, but Nonetheless, what she is certain about is her political choice to identify as Chinese, despite its yellow peril connotations and the immediate implications for her welfare in this dinner discussion where both her boss and her landlady have voiced anti-Chinese sentiments. Although throughout her memoir, as many scholars have pointed out, she draws attention to the disparity between the expectation of Oriental inscrutability and her own hypersensitivity as a disabled, possibly queer mixed-race woman, she does not seek to fully abolish the many-faceted trope of Chinese unfeeling. Her retort is not a refutation, but rather a refiguration of that racialized unfeeling. This mode of unfeeling operates as a condition of survival for the diasporic Chinese, defensive calculus of effective and epistemological disclosures and withholdings that defies the heightened scrutiny of new forms of governmentality over immigration and transnational migrations. It insists on the right to unassimilable alterity that stubbornly resists dissolving into the sameness of universal feeling. Xine Yao's attention to the specific Oriental inscrutability of Chinese women is inflected by their embodiment of a sexualized form of unknowability, codified by the Page Law, that only amplifies that fetishized mystery because so few Chinese women were allowed to enter their nation under a suspicion of being sex workers. Throughout her work, Xine Yao presents the Chinese woman as a foil to the implicitly white new woman and the presumed universality of white womanhood in general. As critics have noted, in one essay, she even implies the term new woman, this supposedly unchanging Chinese who developed signifiers that were adopted by white Western feminist modernity, such as the divided skirt long before the West. And as she points out, actually, the phrase new woman, it can be seen as a direct translation of the Chinese term for new brides. So briefly, I want to read one of her articles, The Chinese Woman in America, as an early articulation of woman of color feminism in the way that, as I suggested, looking at Alzadua Moraga and Audre Lorde, among others, we can read for a type of theorization of feeling, but also unfeeling. And this essay originally appeared in The Land of Sunshine, which was a magazine used to promote California that trafficked in the local color genre. But here, rather than simply exposing these truths of Chineseness, she explores how the Chinese woman's survival calculus of refusals plays into and against Oriental ornamentalist erotics of concealment and hyperfeminization, which her writing mirrors by pairing each reveal with a reminder of the validity of withholding. And so she acknowledges, although there's the popular idea that the Chinese are phlegmatic people, the Chinese woman is brimful of feelings and impressions, and speaking personally, full of coughs. Sorry. Despite this tantalizing glimpse behind the inexpressive Oriental face, she repeatedly affirms their right to dissoluble difference, even if it confers they're unassimilable. She says, quote, "So if you wish to become acquainted with her, if you wish to glean some knowledge of a type of which very little is known, you must seek her out. She will be pleased by your advances and welcome you with demure politeness, but you might wait for all eternity, and she would not come to you," end quote. And I think this is a really important practice that she's highlighting. She's foregrounding the importance of consent from the white reader, that despite all their well-meaning liberal curiosity tied to the cultural politics of recognition, that reader should tolerate the Chinese woman's refusal that would maintain that distancing barrier of inscrutability. In this piece, which does give insight into the lives of Chinese women and their customs, Farr emphasizes the Chinese woman's agency to turn away literally and symbolically. She says, "Do not imagine for an instant that she is dull of comprehension and unable to distinguish friendly visitors from those who merely call to amuse themselves at her expense. I have seen a little Chinese woman deliberately turn her back on persons so ignorant as to whisper about her and exchange knowing smiles in her presence," end quote. Although seemingly overdetermined by an ancient patriarchal culture, the invocation of traditional ways gives the Chinese woman a reprieve from the demands of American belonging, quote. She has a certain admiration for the ways of the foreigner, but nothing can change her reverence for the manners and customs of her country. And she points out how using the phrase, "that not Chinese way," end quote, is a tactic of rejection. More constant than sentimental as the Chinese woman is how Farr sums up the appearance of the Chinese woman's antisociality, given the deliberate prioritization of the sphere of Chinese social life, implicitly contrasted with the sentimentalism of white womanhood. Xine Farr elaborates how the femme artifice of the Chinese woman's dress and other signature ornamentation can be the exercise of personal sovereignty over disclosure and withholding. After all, the practices of face are gendered, quote. If it is necessary to pass a room occupied by men, they do so very demurely, holding open hands before that side of the face, not because they're so shy, but because it's the custom of their country. She will show you her pretty ornaments, her jewelry, and fine clothes, but never invite you near her private chapel, end quote. And that's how she describes the Chinese woman's love of material culture, inextricable from the construction of the Oriental artifice for racialized gender that limits outsider access to her inner life. Chinese woman vanity has a different relationship to spectatorship than does white woman's vanity. She says a Chinese woman paints and powders, dresses and bejewels herself for her own pleasure, places rings on her fingers and bracelets on her arm, and carefully hides herself from the gaze of strangers. According to that cultural paradigm, she's not deceitful or false. Again, her inscrutability is figured as a matter of consent and control over her access to her body. To recall Anne Cheng, the ornamentalism of the yellow woman centers the inorganic. And indeed, it's feast and farce Chinese woman who also delights in her femme Orientalist artifice, expressing herself through beautiful fancy work, representations of insects, flowers, and birds, and most dexterously wrought from silken beads. And she wants to say that this aesthetic practice is not useless at all, but has a type of social value. In contrast to the Western sentimental conflations of the categories of the natural and the good, for the Chinese woman, the realm of the false to the inorganic is no less valid. Quote, she loves flowers, natural or artificial, and if not supplied with the former, makes herself great quantities of the latter and wears them on hair and breast. And so she eschews the privileging of exposure as truth and goodness. The Chinese woman has reason to take refuge in these feminized artifices, regarded as emblematic of Oriental inscrutability. Indeed, I put on my makeup today with this very in mind, and I want to highlight that my eyeshadow is from a Pat McGrath palette, who is one of the leading makeup artists in the world and Black British, perhaps only a fitting tribute for where I'm presenting this. Anyways. At the end of her memoir, she expresses the desire to visit China before she dies, but archival evidence indicates she never did. Instead, the one place outside of North America and outside of her birthplace in England she lived was Jamaica, where in her memoir she identifies as, quote, one of the brown people of the earth. A gesture distancing herself from whiteness and seeking affiliation with other peoples of color, a sense awakened by being in the Caribbean. Across her writings are glimpses of Black, Indigenous, and other women of color characters. As I argue elsewhere, these representations are suggestive of a rethinking, however flawed, of racial global hegemony characterized by Lisa Lowe as those intimacies for continents, towards the possibility of being mobilized as counter-intimacies of solidarity. After all, earlier in my book, Chapter 2, I looked to Martin Delaney's work, where he imagines in Cuba, quote, the Negroes, mulattoes, and quadroons, Indians, and even Chinamen, end quote, drawn together in the Caribbean, vibrant with the potential of anti-colonial revolution. Reading into her oeuvre, then, can one hope that the Oriental inscrutability might be less furtive than fugitive, not just running away, but running toward? In turning away the Chinese face to look away, what can one look to instead? So in closing, I propose that feeling otherwise is the effective precondition for thinking otherwise and imagining otherwise. In our moment, the concept of sympathy has been updated as empathy and the continued hope for a better politics of feeling bound up with morality and justice. I gesture toward the legacies of these expressive requirements for political recognition and the fantasies of justice in present-day American cultural sentiment for racialized immigrants performing citizenship, but also inspired by the defiance of movements like Black Lives Matter, Idle No More, and No DAPL. In my work, I hope to offer a way outside the bind of the poles of critique and defense that have dominated our understanding of sympathy in American scholarship, that also eschews a primarily descriptive way of tracing the workings and effects of feeling and unfeeling. Lingering with rather than debunking the specter of unfeeling and its function as antisocial rebuttal to discourse of universal feeling allow us for greater nuance in our understandings of politics and literature for the marginalized. In contradistinction to the usual insistence on affect in relation to attachments and porousness, we need to acknowledge, too, the effective importance of detachments and boundaries. What possibilities open up when we explore the implication of Edward Glissant's right to opacity in terms of feeling? Can a calculus of unfeeling allow us to better care for ourselves and others? And a bit of methodology. To trace the interrelated differentiations that constitute the global biopolitical apparatus of feeling through the lens of the American context of the point of entry, I've tried to follow unsympathetic Blackness or inscrutability as some of the modes that are illustrative but hardly exhaustive in my book of modes of unfeeling attributed to different populations that flatten out textures within these categories of difference or otherwise allied the changing negotiators between a subject and the collective. And in my work, I've drawn inspiration across different fields of critical race and ethnic studies drawing inspiration from those disciplinary imperatives to critique and dismantle frameworks that pose the universal, dissenting from the co-optation of justice, undeterred from the denigration of the way that queerness, Blackness, indigeneity, and Asian diasporicness have been seen and vilified. And instead, pointing out the way that vilification shows the way that they are sites of disruptive potential for other ways of being, rather than simply refuting them in an attempt to seek inclusion. The aim behind the comparative dimension of my work is to prevent this framework that is dynamic rather than rigid, comparative rather than exclusionary, wherein focusing on contextualized threads of unfeeling help us to provincialize sympathy by splintering its hegemonic universality. These articulations of disaffected insubordination, emergent from the specificities of the imbricated fields, reflect what I see as the productive incommensurable textures of their positionalities and paradigms, that I actually see as a methodological strengths of their convergences that are resistant to those flattening discourses of universalist feeling that both differentiates hierarchically while hypercritically collapsing that very difference that ends up representing the white Western subject. And again, so doing this work, I do not want to pretend to be conclusive or exhaustive, and my hope is only to make openings for others to feel, think, and imagine otherwise. And just this is the final epigraph that I end on, which is the sort of part before the line that people like to quote from, the Audre Lorde, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, is precisely the way that standing alone, the sort of anti-sociality, allows for the possibility of the creation of other coalitions, feelings of color, structures for peoples of color. And I think in a way, if we read this alongside Raymond Williams' structures of feeling, that the master's house is, in a way, it's articulation of the dominant structures of feeling. And Lorde is highlighting the way that this sort of radical refusal allows for the structures of other houses, other structures of feeling, and other sort of coalitions. And thank you very much. I hope I didn't go on for too long, and I apologize for the coughing, but thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you so much, Xine, for that wonderful talk. And I think first of all, I'd love to give you a moment to catch your breath before we move on to the Q&A portion of today's event. And what I particularly appreciate is the way in which your work, while you resist flattening discourses, you point out the way in which discourses of unfeeling flatten out differences between different racial and ethnic groups. And I kind of love the way in which you're now opening up this Q&A for the discussion, consideration of modes of feeling and unfeeling. And so I think that if anyone has questions for Dr. I'd like to invite you to raise your hand, and you can do that by looking under reactions, or you can also feel free to put questions in the chat where she can see them, or I can read them aloud. So please feel free to go ahead. Yeah, Shelby, please.
Hi, Xine. Thank you so much for your talk. This was fabulous. I, of course, have the privilege also of reading the book, so I'm very, very excited to get to hear this. And even though I love the whole thing, I absolutely love the eyeshadow shout out. That was very cool. And more academic talks should have those. So I have two questions, but I'll just start with the first one and maybe circle back to the second one later after other folks get a chance to talk. But I'm wondering about maybe some of the archival paradoxes. I'm wondering if you see the same kind of archival paradoxes that we see kind of from like an Indigenous studies lens, where we see these colonial justifications, like the justification for violence against Indigenous communities, having a lot to do with the role of affect or the role of feeling. And so, like, for example, in like Immanuel Kant's writing, we see these depictions of Indigenous communities and, communities of color all over the world. We see Indigenous communities depicted as drunk, as lazy, as violent, as talentless, as cannibalistic, as passionless, unfeeling, as weak, and then weirdly as hairless. That's a thing he likes to talk about a lot too. So that's like one version of this archival record where we see this depiction of unfeeling being a justification for violence against Indigenous people because they can't feel it anyway. And then on the other hand, we see these justifications for colonial violence like boarding schools or residential schools actually having to do with the sentimentality of Indigenous people, saying that Indigenous families dote on or are too sentimental toward their children, and this being a justification for removing children into places of confinement where they can be re-educated in this less feeling, more objective sort of way. So I'm wondering if you've run into these same kinds of paradoxes and how that paradox kind of leads to the reading of what the power, the colonial power of interpretation is.
Thank you so much, Shelby, for raising that. I've mentioned this phrase in the book, and so Shelby would know it, but for the context of the rest of the audience, like a phrase I continue to use throughout the book is like the colonial politics of recognition, drawing from Glenn Coulthard, who of course is being conversation for Frantz Fanon. And I think it's really important how Coulthard talks about the importance of indigenous rage in relation to reconciliation in what is now called Canada. And what I'm sort of trying to do is sort of like expanding like the way that all these forms like negative affects, like positive affects, like in a way they're all sort of deemed illegitimate. And there's this way that Shelby is pointing out, you're damned if you do and you damned if you don't, according to this paradigm. It ends up being this paradox that we likewise see through the characterizations of Black and other peoples of color as well, that sometimes either it's excessive or it's completely diminished and gone. But either way, like what the flexibility of white supremacy means that it can be mobilized in either way. And so what I think is important is like looking at the archive for those contradictions and sort of moving beyond like the first move that we often we point to students of like, of course, like racism and settler colonialism, anti-Blackness is always self-contradicting because it doesn't have to make sense, right? And so like just pointing out that the logical inconsistency is not the thing itself, but rather it's the persistence that manages to operate despite those problems, which actually operates, I think, on an effective level precisely because it poses as being pre-logical and pre-discursive in a way. And so I think that what's important then is also to show about reading against the grain of the archive. And I try to do this in my introduction, looking at like a lot of really horrible like colonial era early American texts. So looking at Jefferson, Smith, Stanley Stanhope Smith, and Benjamin Rush as people who variously like either basically kept on pitting Black people who were ripped from indigeneity because of chattel slavery against indigenous peoples in America as like who is the worst basically. And in each of these cases they keep on being like, oh, holding up one as being like, oh, they're the more noble one, but the other one is somehow the more savage. And I think like in a way to me that very part of the contradiction in the archive shows that sort of the contradictions and exclusionary way that Blackness and indigeneity in the US national project like pits them against each other as constitutive nadir, but shows again like the way that affect is always seen like it's always going to be used as a ploy against them. And instead what I'm sort of saying is like if we read against the grain of it, of all the times when they are characterizing these negative things, what are they perhaps deliberately mischaracterizing or misrecognizing? In the case of Jefferson, for instance, his infamous anti-Black remarks about the people he enslaved, he says like, oh, they don't seem to show sorrow to the same extent. You can't, and talking about because of melanin, you can't see them blush and so forth. And then you sort of think on the other hand, well, it's also because they know it's a waste of time and energy. Like he's studying them in this like early ethnographic sense, but in a way like that's also a way to distance from those imperatives of like demanding, of course, the type of intimacy, and I say them all the most gross, violating ways that, of course, like he is guilty of doing. And so it only makes sense that effective interiority might be one of the very things that he's trying to that those people enslaved by him are trying to stave off. And yeah, I sort of wish that had been more scope in my book for thinking about like I try in the second chapter to think about Blackness and indigeneity together. And I sort of gesture to a number of people working in Native literary studies, I think in really interesting ways, talk about like Beth Piatote's work, I don't know if I pronounced her name correctly, as well as Carrie Carpenter and others that I think are sort of doing this work, and also I say the work of Diane Million in terms of thinking about felt theory, that there's all these, from all these different positions, I think across, as I say, critical race and ethnic studies, there are all these different dissenting modes and disobedient modes, and that we can sort of see them as converging in ways that are perhaps non-reducible, but also in ways that are sort of trying to fracture that Enlightenment universality. And like sort of pointing out that, yeah, you're the damned if you do, damned if you don't dynamic. Well, how about that's not the only game in town. It's only trying to overrepresent itself as being the universal and the global. But actually, there's all these other ways of feeling and being that have always existed, that continue to exist.
Okay. Actually, wonders if it would be okay if I jump in with a question. Okay, as a complete, well, assimilation. So I think for me, whenever we're thinking about diasporic communities, I think about assimilation, and you mentioned the element of choice earlier in your talk. And so I was wondering to what extent that intersects with assimilation and therefore kind of modes of unfeeling or disaffectedness. So in your work, have you come across subjects that wanted to, I think, adopt I guess maybe other ways of kind of connecting feelings. So I'm not sure if that's something that's come up at all in your work. So I'd be curious to know about that. Or are there those who might resist assimilation for that very reason?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. So this actually relates really nicely to Shelby's comment, because in Sui Sun Far's work, what's interesting is like, even though the usual way that her work tends to be framed is like, she tried to humanize the Chinese at the time when the Chinese are seen as inhuman, that like really reduces the complexity of the stories. Like there's so many stories of failed assimilation, so many stories of like death. There's also so many stories about, Chinese children or mixed race children being taken away by authorities, being taken away by missions, nuns and so forth, or like Chinese mothers killing their children to prevent that sort of assimilation. And what I think is interesting is she continually, for instance, stages that the way that white women are, precisely through their sympathy, end up becoming the villains in these scenarios, that they think that they're rescuing these Chinese children, but they actually end up misgendering them, for instance, and then as well as taking them away from their families, taking them away from their communities. And in ways, I guess, sort of resonant to how Shelby is talking about residential schools, although nowhere near the scale of it, of course. And so what I think is, what I'm also trying to do with the fifth and final chapter is precisely because Chinese exclusion was the sort of occasion that led to the development of all those familiar apparatuses of US immigration, the questioning, and all these other things as a way to try and keep those inscrutable Orientals out. That it also like shows us like the sort of framework for minoritized immigrants in general, that you're supposed to not just make your backstory completely scrutable, show the right documents, tell the right stories, so to speak, but you're also supposed to profess that you really love America. Like it becomes this sort of, it's sort of like what ends up being, I know that gets a lot of critique, but still like the sort of mainstream Asian American, and we could say perhaps also Asian Canadian discourse of the response of being like, where are you really from, to being like, no, I am so from America, I'm so from Canada, which actually means that and I think that in trying to claim that as a type of stake in belonging, it means also claiming then a stake in the sort of anti-Blackness settler colonialism, which is part of these, of course, part of how these states were able to be formed and are maintained. And so I think it's also important for me to, again, sort of trouble thinking about that of Sui Sun Far's position by making sure that I position it alongside all these other structures, precisely because there could be, I think, a way to distance, but also a way to, in which she is cited as, again, sort of the mother of Asian diasporic North American literature generally. But in that sort of move, it's a sort of move that on the level of a syllabus is a type of claiming for a type of Chinese and of course an Asian American belonging on the literary syllabus. But if it's not one that we trouble, then it also ends up falling into those forms of inclusion that perhaps implicitly still hold up, like the American Literature Survey or the Canadian Literature Survey, as basically these other colonial products. And so it's one where personally I turn to her work to sort of find echoes of myself in the archive, but also I feel that her deep discomfort with any form of belonging, which she famously says at the end of her memoir, that she says she doesn't actually want to claim any nation, which I think is a really important point, is also, there's something that's disquieting and uncomfortable and frustrated about her work that I resonate with and that I want to maintain, that cannot be so easily collapsed into saying like, I'm so part of this nation. And it's also funny because she's often also credited with having the first ever use the term Chinese American, and which of course really aligns with this very liberal idea of like Chinese Americanness. And of course, we could think about, say, all the very right-wing Chinese American groups that support Trump, for instance, among other shameful things, or and the continual way that Asians are complicit into playing into the hands of white supremacy. So it's one thing that I feel very strongly about, and also my own lifelong frustration with, the where are you really from, and realizing that my reaction should not be, well, I was born in Toronto, but actually that should not be like that sort of defensiveness actually is a type of unexamined complicity.
Great, thanks so much. And anyone else, please feel free to raise your hand or put questions in the chat. Yeah, please go ahead, Wendy.
Hi, sorry, how do I turn this off? Never mind, I'll do it later. Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I was really interested in, I work on the Japanese Empire, and specifically my work is on Okinawa, but as I've sort of been thinking about the way that that diaspora does and does not sort of get figured within sort of conversations of Japanese American or sort of Japanese diaspora. What's been sort of kind of interesting about that is that a lot of times once sort of people come to the United States or North America, then people who are sort of considered a certain category then sort of in the US context become sort of all collapsed into this one thing called Japanese or Japanese American. And I'm guessing that a lot of that similar kind of thing happens with other diasporas as well, where sort of both colonial and sort of not colonial, but perhaps class or other kinds of differences kind of get collapsed. And then sort of that becomes kind of all figured into then sort of this other category of like Asian or Oriental. And I was wondering how you deal with that, or sort of in relation to, or sort of like that sort of process seems to sort of direct conversations towards like the Asian or the Oriental inscrutability vis-a-vis like white supremacy. But how do you deal with sort of like all of the really complicated power dynamics and negotiations that are happening within sort of these groups?
Thank you so much. And I want to say that I saw the letter that you and Shaista and others have been doing in terms of important work in your department. Thank you so much for doing that form of solidarity. It's something that, so I feel like I've been sort of increasingly reading in Asian studies proper, precisely because, of course, the difference between Asian studies and Asian American studies is one that I know is very fraught, and people trying to work across those sort of differences that I know that, say, like Lily Wong is trying to do in terms of thinking about different Chinese diasporas is quite challenging. And in some recent work, I've been trying to think about the relationship between like Asian and Asian diasporic communities in terms of thinking about indigeneity and settler colonialism, including Asian indigeneity as well. So yeah, like I think that those nuances are the ones that I myself am trying to navigate increasingly. And so in my work, like the Chinese diaspora that, of course, was at that particular time was primarily from Canton, and that's and so there's perhaps a convenient homogeneity, at least in terms of like what the Chinese myths meant at that time. But of course, I think it's very stark that where once like a lot of universities were offering as their Chinese language possibility, like you could do Cantonese, like now that's being phased out and there's only Mandarin. And personally, I find that very strange since my families would speak Cantonese, but they don't only speak it a little bit. But then like, even if I wanted to speak it, like there's no possibility to learn it at any of my universities because now it's just Mandarin, for instance. So I'd say that like, this is sort of a complicated backstory to say that like, that I don't think I particularly address those nuances because under Oriental inscrutability, as you point out, there's a type of flattening out. but there's also, I guess, a point that I'm trying to make that, of course, like there are like Chinese taxonomies of face that I say that keep on being mistranslated. And as Lydia Liu points out, like continue to be like the sort of Western obsession with like, if we only could figure out this thing, then we could understand this. But at the same time, and I noticed that there's also like a lot of scholarship on in anthropology by Chinese and Chinese diasporic scholars that kept on saying like, okay, if they only defined it correctly, this is what it really is. But I guess I always think about this one quotation from Toni Morrison, where she says like, the real function of racism is distraction. There will always be another thing. Like that, in a way, like it is important that like people define like this is how this taxonomy actually works. And so this sort of double-facedness, because this other idea of what a face is important to acknowledge, but also the flattening out in itself can be something that's useful, and also not to have to continue to have to explain, but say working with that type of vilification and that collapse as a potential for coalition. Like I think that's sort of an interesting point to make, precisely because at the early 20th century in particular, the way that Chinese and Japanese were continually pitted against each other, sometimes actually appearing as separate races on the US Census. But then, for instance, like the Japanese would also be considered part of the Yellow Peril later into the century, and yet Jack London's essay on the Yellow Peril actually configures the Japanese as the Brown Peril, for instance. And so we sort of have this other sort of version of the sort of the damned if you do, damned if you don't, in terms of sort of differentiation, where perhaps the insistence on difference is important, but there's also the way in which it is able to be in itself a sort of divide and conquer strategy. And I think we see this, for instance, in the sort of increasing debates around the term Asian American, that of course it was emerged as this coalitional term, and then has been sort of critiqued in like the point of having to disaggregate, especially with the way that Pacific Islanders have been forcefully lumped in. But at the same time, like a lot of those critics, like I know like Jay Caspian Kang and others who are pointing out the problems of the class and so forth, are also like very anti-Black, for instance, that it's the sort of divisiveness which comes under the guise of a call for more complexity, which ends up being a way of distracting and redirecting debate, I think. So I guess like that's the sort of difficulty, that on the one hand, in my project, I'm trying to hold a lot of different distinctiveness, but while also acknowledging the sort of collapse and conflation, but also saying that the collapse and conflation in itself can be useful in those different ways. And I guess like, for instance, in different diasporas, I was talking to some friends who said that, I guess, people who are descended from Indian indentured Indian people in Guyana, for instance, that a lot of the last names were definitely changed to be able to pass in terms of caste. And so that was like an interesting like way of manipulating, say, that sort of collapse and conflation. Likewise, one way that the Chinese sort of evaded those US immigration apparatuses that were modernizing had to do with playing with that conflation, that they knew that they found it hard to tell them apart. They knew that they found it hard to understand how different Chinese last names worked, and like that all the Chinese last names like were very common. And so they used that as a way of manipulating the different sorts of kinships that would allow them to get visas to enter the country. And so I think that's also an important, I guess, story and history to acknowledge. And I feel like it's not really a great answer to you, but I hope that it's kind of a response.
Yes, Jen, please go ahead.
Hi. Thank you so much for the presentation so far. And I know that a lot of the conversation has been largely historically centered, but I am intrigued. I hope you don't mind, but I am intrigued to know how, according to the sort of like these principles that you've sort of laid out, how inscrutability might have, and take your pick. I don't think that it might be too much to address both, but two things in the news very recently having to do with the recall in San Francisco in the schools, and that as a particular moment of Asian and Black Brown community conflict, and the failure of coalition there. And then, of course, this ongoing uprise of violence against Asians on the street, and in particular, like individual bodily based violence. Of course, that seems closer to this idea of inscrutability and its kind of persistence as a kind of touch point of receptivity to certain violences, but nevertheless, like I think that both of these aspects like really have been troubling me and trouble me in the context of these kind of more historically centered conversations. So I wonder if you wanted to speak to that a little bit, or how you are beginning to interpret these things for yourself.
Thank you so much, Jen. So at the end of my book, I sort of do the reveal about, you know, it was me all along, but part of it's also that what I'm trying to do is like sort of thinking about, as Sherry Moraga and Ansel Dua say at the beginning of This Bridge Call Me Back, like think about theory in the flesh. And that also means like acknowledging my experience. And so I talk about how, like, you know, I've variously been told I'm frigid, cold, inscrutable, so forth, but also recognizing during the writing of the book that it's been my friendships with queers, with my BIPOC friends that has helped keep me alive to do the work. And recognizing that amongst ourselves, like we have sort of developed this sort of vernacular and sort of ad hoc calculus of refusals, much like that I see happening in the 19th and turn of the century archive, that these forms of refusal, of, you know, refusing to respond, of strategic disclosure, but also withholding, just being part of the texture of how you operate in everyday life. And perhaps maybe a lot of people in the audience can sort of think about that, like the certain group chats where, you know, that's where you'll turn to after a really distressing encounter or meeting, but like you're not going to have that satisfying Hollywood type clapback at that time because you know it's too dangerous, for instance. But it doesn't mean that you're being passive, or even though you look impassive, perhaps. Instead, it's a way of redirecting your energy towards these other publics that have more meaning for you. And sort of thinking about like the sort of demands being made and the energy that's being required to call for an end of violence that doesn't have simply continue to replicate this need to sacrifice effective interiority for the sake of a spectatorship of pain and suffering, which I think that Black Lives Matter has particularly been good about critiquing, and those sort of images and circulations. So I feel like I can't maybe speak specifically as much to the California example because I just don't know very much about it because it's literally so far away from me. But I would also say that I had heard really promising things about how, say, in Oakland, there's been a lot of work between Asian and Black community leaders in terms of coalition. So I'm afraid I don't know the specific recall that you're talking about, but I mean, I guess an example that I've continued to follow is, for instance, the whole Harvard admissions scenario where like the white supremacists who tried to work their way to undermine affirmative action with Abigail Fisher realized that they could readily turn to elite Asians who feel very embittered and have no sense of a greater collective politics beyond the neoliberal individual, or perhaps a narrow nationalistic sense of cultural nationalism. And even though there's been so much work done by scholars, Asian American scholars in particular, to point out the way that like how anti-Black, anti-Latinx that is, and actually affirmative, like what the real affirmative action has to do with all the white legacy admissions at Harvard, for instance. So I think that's not entirely a satisfactory answer, but I guess it's also one that I think about when, say, like the shootings in Atlanta happened, and at the time I felt it very well. I continue to feel it very keenly because I was the first person of color to be permanent faculty in my department. And I started in 2018. So that probably says something in of itself. And I've been continually surprised that people come up to me and tell me that I'm the first Asian person they've seen who's an academic in the UK, which is quite surprising in a North American setting, because I feel like it's not as exceptional, right? Like that model minority status, but instead it's like it's so white in UK academia that I'm seen as remarkable, but also just how incredibly lonely that is, that say, like, Asian studies exist to some extent, but weirdly through the same colonial structures that literally train the colonists. Like, my institution is right next to SOAS, which is the acronym for the School for Oriental and African Studies, where they train colonial administrators. Or like that Asian studies stuff is happening through the Royal Asiatic Society, which also was this colonial apparatus. And then Asian diasporic studies like basically doesn't really exist, isn't on the radar. And so when the shooting happened, I felt both alone as a person, but also alone in terms of my field of study. And I was going to be teaching actually Ocean Vuong's novel the next day and on Zoom, and I ended up breaking down crying. And fortunately, students were really understanding, and so many of them reached out to me to make sure that I was okay. But then it was very different that later on I went to all my meetings with my colleagues and I was like, I'm not going to show them anything, because I felt that I managed to build a bond with my students of mutual care as opposed to simply like, giving pastoral care. And to me, that felt like it's a very different space than being with an administrative meeting. And so for me, it's been about like the sort of sense again of this calculus of disclosures, withholdings, but also strategic vulnerability, which has been a way of navigating getting certain types of attention at certain times, but also knowing that it's not disingenuous or me simply dissembling by refusing to show how I feel in particular moments. Yeah, so I feel like that's kind of a way to respond. Also, walking around London, and I do like pretending I can't speak English when I don't want to respond to people.
Thanks so much for that response, Xine. I think it resonates deeply as we come upon the 1-year anniversary of the Atlanta shootings. I think a lot of us are thinking about that, feeling it's a heavy moment. Hua Jing, please go ahead.
Hi, sorry I came on late because I had a meeting just overrun. And I'm new to this group, but my connection here is with Dr. Wang Michelle. So I'm from University of Kentucky, and I'm an art historian. And we don't have an Asian studies here at University of Kentucky, but I don't know my question is related, but it just what your last question kind of reminds me of this question that I was going to ask. It's really kind of recent as we observe the Asian American Chinese athletes during the Winter Olympics, and they were really caught in between two cultures. Some decided to compete for China, some decided to stay and compete for USA, and especially these 3 young athletes, right? Nathan Chen and Eileen Gu and Zhu. So anyways, they got so much different treatment in China. And also, I think that the Chinese major media or even the government tone is playing a role in there, in addition to the huge, netizens in China. And I think in certain ways, like Nathan and also Zhu were violently bullied, I think, or violated on the Chinese internet. But then on the other hand, this Eileen Gu is also facing trouble with the U.S. It's questioning her. Well, you have a U.S. citizen, why you're competing? So all of those, and sort of, it's really complex situation, and it's these young generation who grew up in this country. So we're actually facing. You talk about the quote unquote complicit with the white supremacists, but I do see hope in my daughter's generation, who are really kind of are allying with the African American communities, in the issue of the idea on policing, right? And so I guess my question is just on these three. I mean, on the recent Olympic and the situation that these Asian American, Chinese American athletes and how they were treated, on different parts. And what's your take on those? And I mean, this seems to be opening a door for not, I mean, the future Olympics or in other areas. So your take. Thank you.
Thank you. And it really, it's poignant, especially I'm like part of the generation that grew up on Christy Yamaguchi and Michelle Kwan. And I also did figure skating myself. So it's, I guess, my not particularly nuanced thought is like, just to me, it continues from the 19th century, like the continued way that like Chinese diasporic individuals end up being trapped, like, you just end up being pawns between two competing empires. And it's just like an incredibly, a comfortable position to be in as an individual, because like nations either working to claim you or disavow you. And there seems to be no alternative. Like it sort of reminds me how, like, for instance, around the time of the Hong Kong protests, like the sort of problem for a lot of young people from Hong Kong is that like you don't, you want to assert your independence from China, but also like you didn't want to turn like some protesters did to Donald Trump as the solution and American intervention. But it's like, what possibility does exist when you're trapped between such two massive geopolitical forces? And I feel like I don't have a good answer for that, because I hate going back to the earlier question, like that sort of bind of you have to perform your belonging or else you don't deserve to be a part of it. And it seems like the Olympics in particular is an arena where like there's no place for complicated affect. There's no place for any form of dissent or unfeeling, or rather, as I say, like that in fact, perhaps there's so much forms of unfeeling precisely because you're only allowed to have certain forms of affect on the Olympic stage because you're representing nations, and that doesn't allow for any sort of complexity. And so that's not quite an answer, but it's been really interesting to see that, and it makes me think about, well, I feel like we see so many instances over and over again that about last month in the UK, for instance, it was exposed that like a very prominent Chinese person has been accused of being a spy for the Chinese government in the UK, although she was seen as such a major cultural ambassador. And like, I remember just commenting with a friend of mine who's from Hong Kong, but is in Scotland now. It's like, oh great, now the rest of us just get caught in the rest of this garbage. Or say like in Vancouver, the way that the arrest of the one Huawei executive really continues to exacerbate, say, like all the sheer amount of anti-Asian, anti-Chinese sentiment in Vancouver, which I did not realize was going to be such a thing, because I was always told like, oh, there's great dim sum in Vancouver, you're going to love it there, and so forth. But it's like actually has the most blatant anti-Asianness, because this anxieties around like, Asian foreign investment, buying up all the stuff that also becomes a way of overshadowing like the sort of long-term Chinatown communities there, which also have like long, complicated histories alongside Musqueam people in the area as well. I feel like what I gave you is not really an answer so much as a further contextualization. And yeah, I guess and I'm not someone who follows sports very much other than perhaps figure skating. But it does make one question, like, where I guess the problem is also in sports, like you either win or you don't. You either end up at the podium or not. And perhaps that it's a very model for why in other areas, as much as possible, we need to give space for complexity and space for away from, like, I guess, the overwhelming imperative of the nation state. For instance, like so much training, I remember, at least for figure skating, tends to happen at the same arenas that, people aren't necessarily training in the country that they're representing. And so they're getting to know all their colleagues across forms of national difference. But that's not something that, you know, I guess like at the same time, of course, the Olympics ends up being the sort of guise for a type of geopolitical unity, which is often the type of ruse that gets marshaled. And so in a way, perhaps it also mimics the kind of erasure and universalism of the worst types that I was talking about on a historical level. Yeah.
Thank you everyone for coming to hear Dr. Xine Yao's talk today, and I hope to see you again in April when we have the next event in the Asia in-depth series, and that will be a talk by Dr. Kay Duffy, assistant professor at the University of British Columbia, and she will speak on poetry composition at early medieval Chinese court banquets. Thanks so much.